The image of Christ moves you before you have decided what you believe about it. You notice a familiar face on a small card tucked inside an old book. Your hand stops before closing the cover. Nothing has changed in the room, yet something in you has already answered. What reaches you may not be religious certainty. It may be the unfamiliar experience of being seen without first becoming useful. The face is turned toward someone who has brought nothing, explained nothing, and earned nothing. You recognize the difference before you can say why that difference unsettles you. Earlier, someone offered to help clear the table. You answered before considering the offer. Your hands were already gathering what other people had left behind. Nobody demanded that you do it. You simply knew how to belong in a room where something needed carrying. The image belongs to a different kind of moment. It asks for no quick explanation, no reassuring smile, and no evidence that you are managing well. The familiar arrangements that make your presence easy to justify are suddenly absent. What remains feels strangely intimate and almost impossible to explain. You might call the reaction nostalgia. Perhaps the image belongs to a tradition you once knew. Perhaps the face reminds you of someone who mattered. Perhaps the day has been long and your attention is softer than usual. Any of these explanations may be partly true. None fully describes why recognition arrived before thought. Something in you recognized a presence before your mind recognized a reason. Notice which images remain with you afterward. It may not be the triumphant figure surrounded by certainty. It may be a face marked by sorrow, a hand extended towards someone overlooked, or a person kneeling beside another without asking what has been accomplished. The response gathers around a particular quality of attention. There is no requirement to become impressive before entering that attention. No defense is needed for your tiredness, your complicated feelings, or the quiet distance between the life other people admire and the life you actually experience. The image does not ask for a cleaner version of the truth. That absence can feel unbearable when adult life has trained you to arrive through usefulness. You answer competently, you remain available, you make difficult feelings manageable before another person has to encounter them. Even those who genuinely care may know your capabilities more easily than the place where those capabilities become heavy. Then an image associated with compassion reaches what cannot be introduced through competence. The tenderness feels unfamiliar because it does not resemble the arrangement that usually keeps you connected. If your value has become tied to what you carry, being witnessed without a burden can feel less like relief than exposure. The difficulty is not that you feel too much, it is that the feeling does not fit the terms under which you have learned to remain respectable. You can explain duty, you can explain helping, you can explain endurance. Explaining why the face of Christ makes you want to stop performing is harder. Not every response to a Christian image carries the same meaning. For some, such images awaken gratitude and established faith. For others, they recall pressure, judgment, or a community they could not remain within. An image cannot be separated completely from its history. Still, history does not exhaust what becomes active in the present encounter. The question is not whether the image is powerful, it is what your response cannot keep hidden. Through a Jungian lens, an image becomes psychologically significant when it gathers meanings conscious thought cannot comfortably hold together. It does not have to function as an argument or settle a religious question. Its force can come from several human realities meeting inside one recognizable form before language decides how they belong together. Christ, in Jungian interpretation, can function as an image of the self, a symbol associated with psychological wholeness rather than the social identity used in public. That does not mean a person is secretly divine. It does not mean religious doctrine has been explained away. It means the image may carry an experience larger than the identity ordinary life rewards. For someone whose faith is central, this psychological reading does not cancel the spiritual meaning of Christ. For someone uncertain, it does not require a profession of belief. Psychology can describe being inwardly affected. It cannot decide what the image must mean in matters of faith. What becomes visible is the difference between being addressed as a role and being met as a whole person. A role can be praised for patience, reliability, generosity, or strength. Wholeness includes the part that has grown weary of being praised for qualities that leave little room for need. After a difficult week, someone tells you how much they admire the way you handle everything. You smile because the remark is meant kindly. Later, an image of Christ looking towards someone with nothing useful to offer reaches a different place. The compliment and the image do not meet the same person inside you. One recognizes the arrangement you can maintain. The other may reach what that arrangement cannot include. Admiration is not the same as neglect, and care offered imperfectly is still care. Yet being appreciated for strength does not automatically create permission to be tired. You may have become fluent in the first kind of recognition. You learned which qualities reassure others and which feelings complicate the atmosphere. Perhaps nobody explicitly instructed you to hide anything. Sometimes the lesson develops quietly through praise, expectation, and the relief that follows when you remain the person who needs less. A person can be loved sincerely and still become difficult to encounter beyond a familiar role. This helps explain why an image can reach you where conversation does not. The painted face makes no immediate claim on your usefulness. It does not need you to organize its feelings, return its kindness, or protect it from the discomfort of your honesty. That distance should not be mistaken for evidence that human relationships cannot become meaningful. An image cannot replace another person. What it reveals is the condition under which you presently permit yourself to feel seen. Attention becomes easier to receive when nothing can immediately be demanded in return. What happens when compassion appears without giving you a task to complete? The answer may not arrive as comfort. Your breathing may shorten. You may turn away and begin straightening nearby objects, checking what still needs doing, or returning to some manageable responsibility. Familiar activity restores the arrangement through which your value can be demonstrated. From a depth psychology perspective, the difficulty is not that competence is false. Your reliability may be real. Your generosity may be real. The problem begins when those qualities become the only acceptable doorway through which you can imagine deserving attention. The image becomes moving because it seems to bypass that doorway. It reaches the person who has not prepared an explanation, completed a responsibility, or softened a difficult truth for someone else. That does not prove the image carries one universal message. It exposes the contrast between what you are accustomed to offering and what might exist if offering were not the price of admission. This is where the image of suffering can become especially difficult. The figure represented is not valuable because pain makes suffering admirable, nor does sorrow become a moral achievement. What may disturb you is the possibility that a human being does not lose dignity when strength is interrupted. You may readily extend patience towards someone grieving, confused, or depleted. You may sit beside them without asking them to become easier to accommodate. Yet when the same permission approaches your own life, an objection appears. Understanding seems generous everywhere except where you need it. The contradiction becomes visible in ordinary exchanges. A friend apologizes for needing help, and you assure them they have nothing to explain. Later, someone notices that you look tired and offers to take care of a simple errand. Your refusal arrives before you have considered the offer. An image of Christ can enter precisely there, not as a command to become kinder, but as an interruption of the rule that kindness must always travel outward. Its emotional force may come from suggesting that compassion does not have to be earned through usefulness. Faith may be present. Uncertainty may also be present. Neither needs to disappear for the response to become meaningful. A believer can recognize psychological depth without reducing devotion to psychology. Someone unsure what they believe can recognize longing without pretending it has settled every question. The image does not require certainty before the feeling becomes real. Jung understood symbols as psychologically alive when their meaning exceeds what the conscious mind can state completely. The figure of Christ may hold suffering and dignity, humility and authority, solitude and relationship without immediately resolving the tension between them. That tension matters because the identity you show the world may depend on keeping those qualities separate. You may associate dignity with control, authority with certainty, and worth with the absence of visible need. The image unsettles those divisions without demanding that you adopt a different belief. None of this means suffering should be sought or treated as proof of goodness. It does not mean sacrifice always requires self-abandonment. A symbol of compassion can become distorted when it is used to justify the disappearance of personal limits. One afternoon, passing a small chapel, you notice the familiar image through an open doorway. You slow without deciding to. Your hand touches the door frame, then becomes still. There is nowhere you need to sit, nothing you need to explain, and no immediate reason to remain. You continue walking before you understand what happened. The responsibilities waiting for you are unchanged. Nothing has been concluded about religion, yet a question travels with you. Why should being seen without achievement feel more difficult than carrying everything yourself? Perhaps the image recognizes what your strongest identity cannot comfortably receive. The feeling does not yet explain where that identity came from or why it has remained persuasive. It only reveals that the person who performs, reassures, and carries what is required may not be the whole person seeking recognition. Beneath the reaction waits a more demanding possibility. The part that longs to be met without earning it has been present longer than the role that learned to keep it hidden. That role rarely announces itself as a bargain. It appears as consideration, responsibility, and the ability to remain steady when other people need steadiness. Those qualities may be genuine. What remains unnoticed is the condition quietly attached to them. Being valuable becomes easier to recognize when someone else can point to what you provided. Such a condition can develop without cruelty and without a single memorable beginning. A family appreciates the person who remains composed. A workplace rewards the person who never appears overwhelmed. A relationship settles around the partner who understands before asking to be understood. Each arrangement may be reasonable. None necessarily proves that anyone intended harm. Yet together they can narrow the forms of personhood that receive attention. The competent version of you becomes easier for everyone to recognize, including you. Everything else begins waiting for a more convenient moment. Over time, the difference between being loved and being useful becomes difficult to examine, not because love was absent, but because usefulness became the language through which love was most reliably exchanged. You brought patience, practical help, or emotional steadiness. People responded warmly. The arrangement appeared to confirm that giving was simply your natural way of belonging. What it never revealed was how uncertain belonging feels when you bring nothing. At an ordinary gathering, you notice who needs serving, which conversation requires softening, and where an uncomfortable silence might develop. Before anyone asks, you have made yourself necessary. By the time someone wonders whether you are enjoying yourself, the answer feels strangely difficult to locate. Nothing about that evening proves your presence mattered only because you were useful. Others may care for you sincerely, yet if you continually organize the room, they have fewer opportunities to discover what you feel when the room no longer requires your attention. The image of Christ enters that arrangement with unusual force because it is often associated with attention directed toward people whose public usefulness has fallen away. The grieving, the overlooked, and the uncertain do not need to become impressive before they become visible. That does not mean every interpretation of Christ offers the same understanding. Religious communities, personal histories, and convictions shape what anyone sees. For one person, the image communicates mercy. For another, it carries memories of obligation. Psychological interpretation cannot erase those differences. What the response can reveal is the distance between what you consciously believe about compassion and what you permit yourself to receive. You may believe every person deserves tenderness. You may extend that belief towards strangers without hesitation. Yet, when your own need becomes visible, the principle quietly changes. The rule was never that compassion did not exist. The rule was that you should require less of it. Through a Jungian lens, the social personality becomes important here. The persona is not a lie and not an enemy. It is the recognizable form through which a person participates in the shared world. Difficulty begins when that form becomes so successful that everything outside it starts to feel excessive or embarrassing. Your capable identity may have helped you build relationships, fulfill responsibilities, and contribute meaningfully. None of that needs to be dismissed. But when capability becomes compulsory, exhaustion has nowhere legitimate to appear. When patience becomes compulsory, resentment must remain unspoken. The image reaches beyond that recognizable person, not because the public identity is false, but because it is incomplete. A face associated with mercy draws attention to the distance between the self you know how to present and the human reality that remains when presentation becomes impossible. Consider what happens when someone asks how you are doing and waits after the answer. You say that everything is fine. They remain quiet long enough for the familiar response to sound incomplete. Your fingers find something to straighten or carry. The pause feels longer than it actually is. Their silence may communicate care rather than pressure. Still, part of you experiences it as exposure. You know how to answer a practical question. You know how to solve a problem. You are less certain what to do when another person appears interested in the person standing behind the polished answer. The problem is not that you lack words. It is that the safest words are already prepared. You may have learned to offer reassurance before anyone can become uneasy. You may describe your difficulty as temporary, minor, or already handled. The listener receives a version of events that protects them from having to respond. You also remain protected from discovering what their response might have been. This reveals more than discomfort with receiving. It shows how giving can preserve control. When you are the one providing steadiness, you influence the terms of the encounter. You can remain generous without disclosing the depth of your uncertainty. You can create closeness while keeping the most vulnerable part of yourself outside the exchange. That does not make generosity dishonest. A caring action can be real, even when it also serves a protective purpose. People rarely act from only one motive. You may love someone sincerely while relying on helpfulness to avoid the uncertainty of needing them. Giving may have protected you from what being genuinely known requires. An image makes a different kind of encounter possible because it does not ask you to organize a response. The painted face cannot become impatient. The extended hand cannot misunderstand your silence. You remain free to approach inwardly without negotiating another person being confused, unavailable, or unsure how to help. That safety can matter. It also reveals something difficult. If tenderness becomes bearable only when the other presence cannot answer imperfectly, the longing concerns more than spiritual imagery. It concerns the risk of meeting compassion in ordinary human form, where misunderstanding remains possible. A neighbor offers a small favor. The offer is practical and costs them very little. You refuse before considering whether help would actually be welcome. Later, you cannot fully explain the refusal. What arrived faster than thought was not an assessment of the situation, but the familiar need to remain unburdening. The speed of the response is important. A considered refusal allows room for preference. An automatic refusal protects an existing identity. Both may sound polite. Only one leaves space to discover what you actually want. Protective habits often operate before conscious choice arrives. The adjustment appears in the voice that becomes reassuring, the hand that reaches for another task, or the explanation that makes your difficulties sound smaller than they are. Your body begins preserving the arrangement before your thoughts have named it. What becomes frightening is not only the possibility of rejection, it is also the possibility that someone might remain. Remaining would challenge the belief that attention must be purchased through usefulness. It would expose a person who cannot hide behind competence and cannot immediately return what has been offered. Receiving would require tolerating a moment in which value has not been demonstrated. The image of Christ becomes psychologically charged because it can hold precisely that unresolved possibility, whether encountered through faith, art, memory, or cultural familiarity. The figure may represent attention that does not begin by asking what someone has accomplished. Yet religious language can also become woven into the same accounting of worth. Humility may be interpreted as the refusal to acknowledge personal limits. Forgiveness may become pressure to dismiss legitimate hurt. Service may be reduced to the expectation that a good person should remain available regardless of cost. Those interpretations are not identical with faith. They are ways spiritual meaning can become entangled with an existing pattern of self-denial. A person may inherit a sincere tradition while learning to use parts of that tradition against ordinary human needs. The complication lies not in devotion, but in the assumption that devotion must resemble disappearance. When that assumption remains unexamined, the image of Christ can produce two opposing reactions. One part of you moves toward mercy, another anticipates judgment for not being sufficiently patient, forgiving, or selfless. The tenderness can be real, the pressure can also be real. Both may arise in the same moment without either one telling the whole story. What matters is the direction the encounter takes in ordinary life after the intensity has passed. Does it leave you more able to acknowledge your humanity, or more determined to conceal it? One difficult afternoon proves very little. A single emotional response does not settle the meaning of faith. The character of a relationship, or the history of a person, repeated consequences reveal more. Compassion that consistently widens your capacity for honesty does something different from an interpretation that repeatedly turns limitation into shame. Jung understood symbolic life as larger than the conscious identity that tries to explain it. A living symbol may hold weakness beside dignity, dependence beside value, and sorrow beside meaning, without demanding that one side immediately erase the other. Psychological wholeness does not mean becoming morally flawless. It does not invite anyone to imagine themselves above ordinary limitations. The movement is toward recognizing more of what is actually present, including needs, uncertainty, anger, and tenderness that the respectable personality may prefer to leave outside. That recognition unsettles an identity organized around goodness. If you have understood yourself primarily through patience, admitting resentment can feel like betrayal. If you have been praised for strength, wanting support may feel like failure. Qualities you excluded begin to appear incompatible with the person others trust. Yet the image continues, reaching toward the very place that identity cannot comfortably include. What moves you is becoming harder to explain as sentiment or habit. It touches the possibility that mercy cannot remain complete while the person receiving everyone else is always excluded from it. Admitting that exclusion carries a real cost, you may begin noticing the distance between what other people appreciate about you and what they have actually been allowed to know. Some relationships may contain more tenderness than you assumed. Others may feel uncertain when usefulness no longer organizes every exchange. No image can remove that uncertainty. A painting cannot promise that another person will respond with patience. Faith cannot be reduced to a guarantee that every relationship will become reciprocal. The recognition matters precisely because it offers no simple protection from disappointment. The difficult question is not whether you have given too much. It is whether giving became the safest way to remain unseen. That possibility complicates the identity you relied upon. You understood yourself as attentive, responsible, and available. Those qualities were real. What remained less visible was the relief they provided. When you were needed, you did not have to wonder whether someone would remain interested in your ordinary presence. Need created a structure. It gave conversations direction. It clarified your position in a relationship. It allowed another person to receive your warmth without requiring you to reveal how uncertain you felt about receiving theirs. The arrangement could resemble intimacy, while quietly protecting everyone from deeper exposure. Someone offers to take over a responsibility you have carried for years. Their intention may be kind, yet the first sensation is not gratitude. Your hands remain occupied after the task has been removed. You begin explaining why it would be easier if you handled everything yourself. Beneath the practical objection is a question you rarely ask directly. If your familiar contribution becomes unnecessary, what keeps you included? The question may feel unfair to the people who care about you. It can still reveal the uncertainty beneath a role you once mistook for simple competence. The image of Christ can become overwhelming at this point because it suggests recognition that does not depend on performance. Yet the same possibility threatens the arrangement through which you learn to remain connected. Being seen without usefulness sounds merciful until it asks you to release the evidence of belonging you trust most. Part of you may not want the old bargain to disappear. It has been exhausting, but it has also been predictable. You knew how to enter a room. You knew how to make yourself welcome. You knew how to reduce uncertainty by becoming difficult to replace. This does not invalidate the care you offered. It reveals that generosity can carry more than one truth. You may have loved sincerely, while also needing reassurance that your absence would be noticed. The affection was real. The protection was real. Both could live inside the same action. The shadow enters where an admirable identity becomes too narrow to include its hidden reward. In Jungian terms, the shadow is not a verdict about being good or bad. It contains aspects of experience that the conscious personality cannot comfortably admit. Sometimes what remains hidden is anger. Sometimes it is desire. Sometimes it is disappointment. Sometimes it is the wish to control how deeply another person can hurt you by making certain your place is secured through what you provide. Being needed allowed you to influence the terms of closeness. When you offered support, you could decide how much of yourself to reveal. When someone depended on your steadiness, your place appeared secure. Affection did not have to stand alone. It was supported by a practical function that made your contribution visible. That arrangement may have protected you from an honest fear. You did not know whether someone would remain if you were less useful, less composed, or less able to make their life easier. Rather than risk the question, you kept providing reasons for them to stay. This is not the same as manipulation. It does not mean your kindness was a strategy consciously designed to control another person. Human motives are rarely that simple. A protective pattern can shape behavior quietly, while the love expressed through that behavior remains genuine. The harder truth is that certainty obtained through usefulness always requires continued usefulness. The reassurance disappears whenever the task ends. That is why rest can feel uncomfortable. Even in a room with people you love, your place seems clear only while something still needs doing. When nothing requires your attention, you may begin scanning for an errand. Oui, la question. or a practical detail others have overlooked, the impulse appears considerate. It may also protect you from discovering what happens when your presence is no longer being justified. Standing still can feel more exposing than carrying everything. This is part of the honest cost of recognition. Once the old arrangement becomes visible, it may stop feeling entirely natural before another form of belonging has become familiar. There can be an interval in which you no longer trust constant usefulness but do not yet know how to remain without it. Some people may be confused when you do less. They may interpret the change as distance because your care and your availability have always appeared inseparable. Others may welcome the opportunity to share responsibility. You cannot know which response belongs to which relationship without time and context. That uncertainty cannot be solved by interpreting one expression, one disappointed reaction, or one awkward conversation. Human relationships contain affection, expectation, and misunderstanding together. The shift becomes clearer through repeated interactions rather than a quick verdict about another person. The image of Christ remains important because the same pattern can shape spiritual interpretation. The suffering Christ may feel easier to recognize than images associated with receiving care, sharing a meal, withdrawing into solitude, or refusing to let public expectations determine every action. You may be drawn toward the aspects of the image that confirm what you already know how to become. Endurance feels recognizable, service feels respectable, sorrow carried quietly may seem more understandable than the possibility of being cared for without apology. Suffering can feel familiar when love has become confused with endurance. This does not mean Christian devotion is merely an attraction to pain. It does not reduce the meaning of sacrifice to personal psychology. It means someone can interpret a spiritual image through a pre-existing assumption that love becomes most legitimate when it requires personal depletion. Then compassion risks becoming another standard you must meet rather than an experience you are permitted to receive. You admire mercy while withholding it from yourself. You honor humility while confusing humility with silence. You value forgiveness while assuming that acknowledging hurt would make you less generous. These distortions can feel convincing because they borrow the language of sincere moral commitment. The wish to be patient may be real. The desire to care may be real. Yet a virtue becomes psychologically complicated when it allows no room for its own human limits. Kindness that cannot acknowledge exhaustion gradually stops being freely chosen. Forgiveness that cannot coexist with honesty becomes difficult to distinguish from silence. Service that cannot make room for rest begins to require the disappearance of the person offering it. The image that once felt comforting may then produce conflicting reactions. One moment it seems to offer welcome. Another moment it appears to measure everything you have failed to give. The difference may lie less in the image than in the internal voice interpreting what compassion requires. A religious tradition can hold meanings far beyond psychological explanation. At the same time, a person can bring inherited expectations into that tradition without recognizing them. Distinguishing devotion from the assumption that goodness means never troubling anyone does not diminish belief. Consider what happens when someone asks whether a decision hurt you. You immediately soften your expression. You say you understand why it happened. Your explanation is thoughtful and may be accurate. Yet later, alone with an image of Christ, You feel a pressure behind your eyes that the conversation never permitted. That feeling may not be anger alone. It may be grief at how quickly you abandoned your experience to preserve the appearance of understanding. Compassion toward another person became easier to express than honesty about what their decision cost you. The image reaches the excluded feeling because it appears to witness suffering without arguing against it. It does not interrupt to explain that your reaction is inconvenient. It does not demand that understanding someone else should immediately remove the reality of your own hurt. This does not mean anger should govern the encounter, nor does it mean understanding another person was wrong. The deeper difficulty is the assumption that kindness and truthful recognition cannot exist in the same conversation. What if the feeling that unsettles you is not opposed to compassion, but excluded from it? The question changes the meaning of the image. You may have imagined Christ as representing only gentleness, patience, or moral purity, yet religious traditions also contain images of grief, conflict, solitude, and refusal to reduce human dignity to public approval. A psychologically meaningful encounter does not require turning any of those qualities into instructions. It asks whether your understanding of goodness has become too narrow to include a full human life. If sorrow is permitted only in others, your own sorrow becomes shameful. If anger is recognized only when someone else has been hurt, your own limits become difficult to defend inwardly. If compassion moves in one direction, tenderness becomes another demand. The part of you receiving everyone else remains outside the care you believe other people deserve. Jung was concerned with the danger of identifying wholeness exclusively with an idealized image of perfection. A symbol can point toward greater psychological totality, while the conscious mind interprets it through a divided moral lens. Everything bright and admirable gets welcomed. Everything uncertain, inconvenient, embodied, or emotionally difficult gets pushed outside. The problem is not spiritual aspiration. It is the assumption that becoming more whole requires becoming less human. This is not a claim that Christ contains wrongdoing or that faith needs correcting by psychology. It concerns the way someone can use an idealized spiritual image to reject ordinary limitations. An image associated with mercy becomes painful when it is enlisted in defending an identity that cannot tolerate imperfection. The problem is not that the ideal exists. It is that your humanity keeps being measured against it. At another moment, you pass the chapel again. The same image remains visible through the doorway. This time your hand does not reach toward the frame. It stays by your side. The change is small, but the stillness reveals something unfamiliar. You are present without preparing an explanation for why you deserve to remain. The moment does not resolve anything. You may still feel tenderness and uncertainty together. You may still carry memories of religious pressure or questions that remain unanswered. Yet the image appears less like a demand for improvement and more like a witness to the part of you that has been missing from your own account. That possibility introduces a different kind of grief. You may begin seeing how often you offered others the acceptance you could not imagine receiving. You made room for uncertainty in everyone else, while treating your own uncertainty as something to conceal. You may also recognize how disappointment remained hidden beneath generosity. Perhaps some part of you hoped someone would eventually notice the need you never allowed yourself to name. You kept giving, not only because you cared, but because giving was the language through which you hoped to be understood. When the hoped-for recognition did not arrive, resentment appeared. Admitting that resentment felt incompatible with the identity of the generous person, so the disappointment was explained away, redirected, or folded into greater effort. The response was understandable. It was also costly. The more completely you relied on giving to express an unspoken need, the less likely anyone became to recognize that a need existed. Your competence concealed the very longing your efforts were trying to communicate. The image of Christ interrupts that cycle by placing mercy outside the familiar exchange. For a moment, nothing has to be earned. No emotional account needs balancing. The reaction becomes difficult because it reveals how long you have sought acceptance through methods that make receiving almost impossible. You may not know how to change that immediately. Recognition does not erase the role that protected you. It simply makes the old certainty harder to maintain. The identity built around carrying everything cannot fully explain why being witnessed without a burden feels both beautiful and almost unbearable. Beneath the difficulty waits a quieter possibility. If the image moves you because it makes room for what your strongest identity excluded, then compassion may require more than becoming endlessly available. It may require admitting that the person you protected others from seeing has also been waiting to be met. Being met does not begin with becoming a different person. It begins when the familiar person can no longer account for everything you feel. You remain attentive, responsible, and generous. You still care about the people around you. What changes is the growing awareness that those qualities cannot represent the whole of a life. The image of Christ does not ask that recognition to become a public declaration. It may remain private, uncertain, and difficult to explain. You might encounter the same image again and feel nothing unusual. Another day, the expression of tenderness reaches you before any explanation appears. Meaning does not need to remain constant to matter. What matters is the direction the encounter leaves behind. Does your understanding of compassion become wide enough to include your limitations? Or does it become another demand for perfection? The answer is not contained in one powerful feeling. It becomes visible through repeated moments in ordinary life. Someone asks how you are doing, and the familiar answer arrives automatically. You mention responsibilities. Reassure them that everything is manageable, and direct attention toward their concerns. Nothing unusual appears to have happened. Later, you recognize the small disappearance concealed inside an ordinary exchange. You were present, but the part that needed meeting never entered the room. That recognition does not mean the other person failed you. They may simply have followed the version of the conversation you made available, nor does it mean every relationship should accommodate your deepest feelings. It reveals how thoroughly the old arrangement shapes what others are permitted to encounter. The change may appear as a slight interruption. Someone offers assistance, and your refusal does not arrive immediately. Someone asks whether a difficult event affected you, and the answer becomes less polished. A responsibility remains unfinished without instantly becoming evidence that you have lost your worth. These moments are not dramatic transformations. You may still feel uneasy. You may still wonder whether accepting kindness creates a debt. Yet the old assumption no longer disappears completely beneath habit. Another possibility begins entering adult life before it feels entirely believable. through a Jungian lens. That shift concerns more than confidence. It suggests that the conscious identity is becoming less able to exclude experiences that do not fit its preferred image. Need, uncertainty, disappointment, and tenderness begin appearing without automatically disqualifying the person who feels them. This is not the same as becoming passive or abandoning responsibility. Psychological wholeness does not erase discernment. It does not require trusting everyone, revealing everything, or accepting every offer of care. The capacity to give remains. Giving simply stops being the only measure of a human life. The image of Christ can illuminate this distinction because its meaning is not exhausted by public success, composure, or approval, depending on personal belief and tradition. The figure may hold mercy, sorrow, dignity, solitude, and relationship together. The encounter matters where those qualities challenge the narrow conditions you attach to belonging. The image does not have to settle what you believe to reveal what you excluded. For a person of faith, recognition may deepen an existing relationship with spiritual meaning. Familiar ideas about grace may become more intimate and more difficult. It is one thing to believe compassion exists. It is another to consider that the person receiving everyone else might also belong within it. For someone uncertain, the experience may remain a psychological question without becoming a declaration of belief. A person can be moved by an image without pretending certainty about what lies beyond it. Neither openness nor doubt must be forced into a conclusion before the experience becomes meaningful. For someone carrying painful memories of religion, the response may contain unease as well as longing. An image can evoke belonging while also recalling judgment. Recognizing both does not require rejecting every spiritual meaning or defending everything done in its name. The distinction concerns the direction of compassion. An interpretation that consistently increases shame does something different from one that makes honesty possible. An image that becomes an argument against your humanity is not being encountered in the same way as an image that allows your humanity to appear. This difference can become visible in relationships that depended on your steady availability. Someone may notice that you do not answer every request immediately. They may feel disappointed, confused, or concerned. Their reaction is not automatically evidence that affection was absent. Changes in a familiar arrangement can unsettle people who never realized the arrangement existed. Another person may respond with curiosity. They may ask what has changed and remain long enough to hear an imperfect answer. Even that response may not feel comfortable at first. Receiving understanding does not instantly remove the habit of explaining yourself into acceptability. You may still soften the truth. You may still reassure someone before you have decided what you feel. The difference is that the impulse can become visible without being mistaken for the whole truth. The person you become around compassion matters more than the intensity of the encounter. If an image leaves you more ashamed of ordinary needs, that consequence deserves attention. If it allows grief to appear without demanding immediate improvement, something different may be happening. Meaning emerges through direction, context, and repeated experience rather than one overwhelming moment. This also changes how sacrifice is understood. Caring for others can remain meaningful. Responsibility can be freely chosen. Devotion can involve commitments that extend beyond convenience. None of these realities requires treating your disappearance as the price of moral seriousness. The difference lies in whether care stays connected to your full humanity. When tiredness, uncertainty, and limitation can be acknowledged, generosity has room to become a choice rather than a compulsory identity. You do not become less caring by recognizing the cost of care. Forgiveness also becomes more complicated and more honest. Someone may release bitterness gradually while still acknowledging that trust has changed. Compassion can coexist with disappointment. Understanding another person does not require denying the effect their behavior had on your life. These truths can feel unfamiliar when goodness has been defined through endless accommodation. You may worry that acknowledging hurt makes you less faithful or less patient. Yet an identity that cannot include honest sorrow becomes increasingly dependent on keeping part of life outside awareness. The excluded feeling does not disappear when it is judged. It may appear as fatigue during familiar conversations, reluctance when another request arrives, or unexpected sadness when someone offers kindness without asking anything back. Mogo corrections proves a specific diagnosis or determines the meaning of a relationship. They reveal that the polished account no longer contains everything. Someone tells you they admire your strength. The appreciation is genuine, and you can receive it. Yet another recognition appears beside the compliment. You notice the part of you that wishes someone would remain present even when strength is not the quality being offered. That wish does not make gratitude dishonest. It does not transform the other person into an opponent. It reveals that admiration and intimacy are not identical. Being valued for what you manage may be meaningful, but it does not always answer the desire to be known when nothing remains to manage. A person you trust asks whether they can help. The old refusal approaches. Your hand begins moving toward the task, then becomes still. The pause does not make you certain. It simply creates enough room to discover whether you actually want the help being offered. You might still say no. The difference is that refusal no longer has to arrive before you exist inside the decision. A preference can appear where automatic protection used to speak first. That small interval contains more honesty than an impressive declaration of change. Later, the image of Christ appears again in an ordinary place. Perhaps it is the card inside the book. Perhaps it is a painting glimpsed during a visit. The response is quieter now. You are less interested in deciding whether the feeling makes you strong, weak, faithful, or uncertain. You notice what the image does not demand. It does not ask you to become more impressive before being seen. It does not insist that uncertainty invalidates tenderness. It does not require suffering to become proof that you deserve attention. That absence of demand does not settle a spiritual question. For a believer, the encounter may remain inseparable from grace. For someone uncertain, it may feel like the recognition of a human longing that had never been granted language. Psychology has no authority to decide which meaning is ultimate. What it can identify is the movement away from an identity that admits compassion only when compassion travels outward. The shift is not toward perfection. It is toward allowing more of your actual experience to remain present without immediately converting it into a problem. Nothing guarantees that others will respond well. Some relationships may remain organized around your willingness to carry more than your share. Some people may need time to understand a version of you that is less immediately available. Others may reveal patience once they encounter more than polished competence. You cannot know which response belongs to which person before it occurs. That uncertainty is part of what usefulness protected you from facing. Remaining indispensable provided reassurance that your presence mattered. Becoming more visible without that protection introduces a question no image can answer on behalf of another person. The risk of being known cannot be removed by becoming easier to need. This is where the shadow becomes less threatening and more ordinary. The wish to be cared for no longer has to hide behind resentment. The desire to be chosen without performing does not need to disguise itself as endless helpfulness. Anger can be recognized without becoming cruelty. Sadness can exist without becoming a verdict against your character. Dependence can appear without canceling competence. Uncertainty can coexist with faith. None of these experiences guarantees peace. Together they make the old division between admirable qualities and inconvenient humanity less absolute. Wholeness does not mean resolving these contradictions forever. You may remain conflicted. You may continue to prefer giving in many situations. You may still value responsibility, service, and care. The difference is that those qualities no longer have to erase everything else in order to remain meaningful. The image of Christ retains its mystery inside that movement. It does not become a psychological formula. It does not need to serve as proof of a doctrine. Its force may lie partly in refusing to fit entirely inside explanations you already possess. A living symbol can hold more than the conscious mind is ready to organize. It may evoke compassion and grief, devotion and uncertainty, human limitation, and a longing for greater wholeness. The encounter becomes less honest when one explanation is forced to erase every other dimension. For someone whose faith has sustained them, psychological reflection does not need to diminish reverence. It may reveal where spiritual language became tangled with expectations that were never identical to faith. Compassion can remain sacred without becoming an argument against ordinary human needs. For someone uncertain, the same image may remain meaningful without requiring an answer that cannot yet be given. Not knowing what to believe does not cancel the reality of being inwardly affected. Sometimes the first honest relationship with a symbol begins by refusing to decide too quickly what it must mean. The question gradually changes from whether you deserve tenderness to what tenderness makes possible. Perhaps it becomes easier to accept help without immediately repaying it. Perhaps a conversation contains one honest sentence that would once have been softened. Perhaps tiredness can be recognized without becoming moral failure. These moments do not announce a different personality. They show that the familiar one is no longer carrying the entire story. You may still love the people who benefited from your steadiness. You may still value the commitments that gave your life structure. You may also grieve how rarely you allowed yourself to appear without a useful role. None of these truths must erase the others. One evening, you pass the chapel again. The doorway remains open. The same image rests inside the dimness. You stop without deciding what the moment should mean. Your hands remain at your sides. Nothing needs carrying. And for once, the absence of a task does not immediately send you away. The face has not changed. What has changed is the position from which you encounter it. You are no longer looking only for confirmation that you should become more patient, more forgiving, or more useful. For a moment, you can recognize that the person feeling moved does not stand outside the compassion the image represents. No final answer about faith arrives. The people in your life remain complicated. The responsibilities waiting for you are still real. You may continue wondering whether another person can meet you when you have nothing prepared. Recognition does not remove that uncertainty. What it changes is the assumption that uncertainty makes your humanity less worthy of attention. The image did not ask you to become better before it reached you. It reached the place that had mistaken usefulness for belonging and composure for the only acceptable form of dignity. Perhaps the response came before understanding because the part being addressed had spent years waiting beneath explanation. You knew how to recognize suffering in others. You knew how to offer patience without asking them to earn it. What remained difficult was imagining that the same attention could include you. The image remained, and so did the person it had reached.